More on the U.S.-Cuba diplomatic relations. We now cross live to our reporter in the U.S., Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, a very good afternoon to you. Could we be witnessing history here? We hear that the senior U.S. diplomat in Havana delivered a letter from President Barack Obama addressed to the Cuban President Raul Castro about the restoration of diplomatic relations between the two countries. Do we know what the contents of that letter are?
We certainly do, Alicia. The contents of that letter reveals that on July 20th, both Washington and Havana will officially reopen embassies and restore diplomatic relations between the two countries after something like 54 years. It is certainly a historic moment. I think this president has, as I mentioned in that piece, his legacy firmly in sight as he nears the end of his term. So he's really ticking off various issues from his bucket list in terms of what he wants to achieve before his successor takes the White House. And I think the significance of what we're seeing in terms of the Cuba-United States relationship is that in December last year, he said, look, enough of this policy of estrangement, enough of this, with the long-term view that the economic blockade has to go. That, of course, you have to understand is only going to be removed from an act of Congress. The president does not have the executive authority to do that. So in the absence of agreement in the two houses of Congress, this president is doing everything in his power to say enough with this policy that has failed for over 50 years. We have to try something new. Remember, Alicia, the United Nations has passed 23 resolutions calling for the United States to remove this blockade. And every time, each year, the United States, supported by Israel and 2 or 3 other countries, has blocked the world's affirmation of the need to remove this blockade. So he is doing everything in his power, within the limits of his executive authority, to change the focus and to recalibrate this conversation between these two countries.
Sherwin, look, how important is such a breakthrough? Where does it start for both countries?
It starts really with the president that has realized, if you look not only at his engagement with Cuba, if you look at his reaching out to Iran on the nuclear issue, this is a president that believes you have to engage with your foes if you want to have progress. If a policy doesn't work, and this is an argument very clearly in his State of the Nation in February this year, that if a policy that doesn't have the impact and the effect that you desire, surely then it is time to change that policy. So this is a president that is listening to his international counterparts. President Zuma, on a 2010 state visit to Cuba and on several visits to the United Nations and to Washington, has made the case for this embargo to be lifted. And I think finally we have a president in office that is saying enough of this decades-long approach. We need a shift. And whether or not we have the current support we require in Congress to remove this, I am going to do everything in my power to ensure that this conversation is shifted under my watch.
Look, Sherwin, before I let you go, going into the next presidential elections, and you've just touched on that now, how will this change the way Americans vote, Sherwin? We know Hillary Clinton has always shared similar mindset with Obama on such issues. This must be quite a boost for her.
It could very well be a boost for her. I think what you've seen on the gay rights question and certainly on the Cuban issue is that a majority of Americans now believe in both. They believe in gay marriage in the United States, which was affirmed by the Supreme Court, and they also believe that enough of the policy of isolating Cuba. Remember, the United States has similar relations with similar-minded countries. China, Vietnam, Myanmar, for example, come to mind. They have diplomatic relations with countries. So why on earth would you not want to extend that same courtesy to the Cubans, whether you disagree or not? Let's not misunderstand what is happening today. This is the beginning. This is not the end of the relationship. There are a lot these two countries disagree on. The freedom of movement, the freedom of the press, things like that. They're probably going to head back. But they will do that diplomatically now because the relations are open. Whether this will be a boost for Hillary Clinton, whether this will be a boost for the Republicans, let's wait for 2016, Alicia.
And what are the Americans and Cubans saying on the ground?
Well, Cuba's society, I think, this is an important point. Cuba has been a very isolated society because of this embargo for a very long time. You have a socialist-type system. You have the Communist Party, which essentially runs the government and Cuban society. And so what you're going to see is you're going to see a sort of Vietnam-China transition. Elements of capitalism, elements of foreign direct investment, but you're still going to have control that essentially maintains by the government. And so there is fear. We've spoken to a number of Cuban economists from the University of Havana. They were on a trip to New York recently, and they spoke about how the egalitarian society that Fidel Castro and his governments and his successors have worked to maintain for so long. And as you see more money coming into the Cuban economy, you're going to see different classes emerge. So it's not all going to be positive, because if you go to Cuba today, you will see how that equality, that egalitarian society is slowly beginning to shift as a free market sort of system is introduced into the socialist system there.
We'll definitely keep tabs on that story. That's Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC U.S. correspondent, talking to us about interesting developments between the U.S. and Cuba on bilateral ties.